So, in today's Tanya, we're in the middle of chapter 2. I would say actually probably right in the middle. Again, it's at jewisharcadia.com/7881. And that's how to find the link for the text. If you're following along from the OG, from the original Tanya, it's on page 12, about halfway down the page. So, we talked about last week we talked about how the soul of every Jew comes from God. It's literally a piece of God above. And we gave the analogy that it's like a son who comes from the father. And we know now today with science, which wasn't around in the Alter Rebbe's time, but the Alter Rebbe knew it from Jewish science, from Torah, and that is that we have the DNA of Hashem, the spiritual DNA, that is, of Hashem. And actually, only today do we appreciate how accurate the Alter Rebbe's mashal is, because nowadays we see that a child has the DNA of the father, or both parents actually, right? And even after the fetus develops into a full child, it still is intrinsically connected with the father. Now, the question remains, yes, it's true that after it developed into a full-grown child with its own fingernails and toenails, it's still the brain of the father. But nevertheless, it left the realm of being a brain, and now it's toenails. Toenails are not a brain. So what connection do toenails have to a brain? So you might say it's the same DNA, but it's toenails. It's not a brain. So the Alter Rebbe continues to say as follows: V'gam achshav babein. And also now, in the son, in the child, Yenikas atziparnayim v'chayusam, the nurture of the fingernails and their life, meaning their ability to grow, nimshachas me'amoyach shebaraish, comes from the brain and the head. So we were saying last week that the reason why these two entities are connected, the father and the son, the toenails and the brain, is because at the very essence of the drop from the father, it contains the potential for even toenails. So that the drop doesn't change from its essence. So therefore, after the child is born and becomes independent, the toenails get their life force, they get their vitality, their ability to grow from its own brain, meaning the son's own brain is what enables the toenails to grow. And without the brain, the toenails would stop growing, because everything in the body receives its commands from the command center, which is the brain. So it turns out that even the toenails or the fingernails, the way they are right now in the son independently, they have a clear connection to the brain, because everything it has comes from the brain, and therefore the toenails have to be connected to the brain in order to receive vitality. And that's why if your toenail is hurting, right? If you have an ingrown toenail, or you have a loose toenail hanging off, right? You pull that thing off, what's going to happen? Ow, it hurts. It hurts your brain too. Your brain registers, there's a problem in my toenail. Now, the truth is, not only is the toenail connected to the son's own brain, but really, it's connected with the father's brain. Why? Because the son's brain is connected to the father's brain. Because when the father's brain became the son's brain, or the essence from the father, the drop from the father, which comes from the father's brain, became the son's brain, it didn't change in form. You had it came from a brain and it landed in a brain, right? So when the son's toenails are coming from his own brain, indirectly those toenails are connected to the brain of the father as well. Now, where do we see the proof that the toenails are connected to the brain? So he doesn't bring a proof from science, because this is not a science class, but this is a Torah class. Kedeisa b'Gemara, as it's stated in Gemara, in the last tractate of Talmud, Nida, Sham, over there on page 31 of tractate Nida, it says over there, Loiven, the whiteness, Shemimenu gidim ha'atzamais v'tziparnayim. The whiteness of the father, in other words, the white part of the semen, from which the sinews and the bones and the nails, they all come from that drop. So you see that all the various body parts of the child come from that one drop. And he brings a Kabbalistic source as well. As it's written in the book Eitz Chaim, the gate of Chashmal. Today in modern Hebrew, Chashmal means electricity, but that's not what it means in the original Hebrew. Chashmal is the name of an angel. But anyways, in that section of the book Eitz Chaim, it says, "Beside levushim shel Adam Rishon megan Eden," in the secrets of the garments of Adam Rishon in the Garden of Eden, that the nails were from the contemplating brain. So basically, what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, and it's actually in brackets, is that according to Kabbalah, there's a deep connection between the nails and the brain, because it says over here that the nails came from the brain. It's brought in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Our sages teach us that what did Adam Arishon wear before the sin, right? We all know what he wore after the sin, right? God made for him and Chava garments of leather, of skin, right? Right before that, where were they hiding? They were hiding amongst fig leaves, right? But what about before that? So it says that their skin was made out of nails. In other words, they weren't wearing clothes separate from their bodies. It does say they were naked, but their garments were like nails. In other words, the way I understand it is that their entire body, the entire skin of their bodies, was as thick as nails. Was like the material of fingernails. I guess most of it got shaved off, and you have a little remnants of that. Perhaps that's I don't know. I'm just hypothesizing here, but perhaps that's why we look at our nails in the candles by Havdalah, right? Because why do we have the candle by Havdalah? To resemble Adam Rishon, the first man who made the first fire on Saturday night. So what do we look at? The little bit that we have remaining from Adam Rishon, the nails. Anyways, that's just my own hypothesis about that connection. But getting back to what we're saying here, the Eitz Chaim says that the deeper meaning of these garments of Adam Rishon is that these nails came from Mayach Tevuna, which Tevuna comes from the word Bina, which is understanding. It's a certain quality of the brain. The brain has ideas, and the brain could contemplate and comprehend those ideas in a more broad way. So the point being made in that Kabbalistic source is that nails are associated with the brain. That's all we're trying to say. So in short, in this whole analogy about the son and the father's brain, we see three things. Number one is that all body parts come from the drop of the brain of the father. However, during the time of pregnancy, while the child's in utero, this drop transforms and changes over from one level to another till they become fully grown limbs, including nails. That's one point. Number two, despite all these changes, even though they, it's so, extreme, the change that happens in that time, to the point that you even have fingernails or toenails, all of these limbs remain one entity with their root, with their source, which is that one drop. And lastly, even after the child is born and becomes a thing for himself, the nails still get their own life force from the son's brain. That means that nails are still connected to the brain. And that's how the nails are connected to the father as well. Because through being connected to the brain, they're being connected to the father too. Now, what does this mean? What's this whole analogy relating to us? So the Alter Rebbe continues now, going back to the soul. And so too, literally, so to speak, when we're talking about all the various levels of every Jewish soul's neshama, whether it's the level of nefesh, ruach, or neshama that we spoke about last week, in its roots above, as it descends from one level to another level, through the chain effect of the various worlds, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya, which are the four Kabbalistic spiritual worlds. The soul comes from God's wisdom, as it says in Tehillim chapter 104, Kulam b'chachma asisa. You have made all of them. You have made all of your creations from the supernal chachma. From there, from that original source, comes the souls of just the simpletons, the masses, and even people with very low ranks of souls. So, just like we said in the analogy, that at the root, the entire body is connected to the drop of the father. However, through the process of pregnancy, through the passageway, if you want to call it, of pregnancy, new limbs are developed, various different limbs. So too, when it comes to souls, they all come from the same source. They all come from the drop, from the dot of Hashem, the semen, so to speak. However, I'm just going to admit somebody to here. I don't know my mouse is not working. Now it's working. There we go. So although we all come from that dot of Hashem, that whiteness, if you want to call it, however, through the soul passing through the various spiritual worlds of Bria, Yetzira, Asiya, and Atzilos, what you end up with is all different sorts of levels of neshamas, just like you have all different sorts of limbs in the body, right? Now, just to give a little background, or I think for most of you here on Zoom, it's a refresh, but for those who are watching on YouTube and may not be familiar, we'll just give a little background on the worlds, the spiritual worlds. So in Kabbalah and Hasidus, it explains that Hashem created this physical world through something called Seder Hishtalshalut, the order of devolution, or the order of a chain process. So there's an entire spiritual structure of different worlds, one beneath the other, and we're not talking about in space. There's no physical other worlds that we're referring to here, but we're talking about in rank, that each world is one rank lower than the next, and the lower you go within these worlds, the more the godly light is concealed and hidden within that world, until we get from the lowest of the four spiritual worlds, we reach our world, in which physicality is present and we don't see godliness. So this structure of all these worlds, it's called Hishtalshalos, because the word in Hebrew for ishtalshelus comes from the word shalsheles, which means a chain, which a chain has different links that are attached to one another, and each one is systematically placed one beneath the other. And so in general, there are 4 spiritual worlds, which are called Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Now, what's the general difference between them? The highest of these 4 worlds is called Atzilus, which means, it comes from the word Ha'atzala, which means to like separate, to kind of siphon off, because Hashem basically just took a piece of himself, and that is what Atzilus is. It's literally revealing an element of godliness. So basically Hashem said, I'm not going to reveal my essence, but I will express myself in 10 different ways. So it's 10 expressions of godliness. And those 10 expressions are what we call a world, or the world of Atzilus. So it's not really that Hashem created anything new, but he just expressed himself in 10 different ways. And this container of, if you will, of these expressions are called the world of Atzilus. From the world of Atzilus, it devolved into the world of Bria. Bria means creation. That means this is where the first creations, spiritual creations, came about, were created. In other words, angels and things like that. But they are sort of things that have their own identity to some extent. From the world of Bria, it devolved into the world of Yetzira, which means the world of formation. It comes from the word form, because in the world of in the world of Bria, those entities don't really have a form and a structure, so to speak, and it's only in the world of Yetzira where they take on sort of, again, this is all spiritually speaking, some sort of spiritual structure. Then you go from there, it devolves into the world of Asiya, the spiritual Asiya world, which Asiya means to make or to correct. Like it says in Deuteronomy, and she shall make her nails. It doesn't mean, I don't know, put some powder and glue together and make nails, but it means to correct the nails, right? To make the nails look nice. As we say over here in English, get your nails did, right? It doesn't mean to actually make them. So too, the world of Asiya is the completion and the full correction. In other words, the process of bringing things to a state of perfection. But this is just the spiritual Asiya world, and from that spiritual Asiya, we get to the Asiya, the physical Asiya that we're in. Now, this is just a broad overview of the 4 worlds, and Jewish souls come from Hashem's wisdom, as we said earlier, meaning they come from the highest of these 4 worlds, the world of Atzilus, and even within Atzilus, which we said is 10 expressions of godliness, what's the highest of those 10 expressions? It's something called Chachma, wisdom. And so, although each of those worlds have those 10 expressions, but the Chachma Ilah, the supernal wisdom, means the wisdom of the highest of these 4 worlds. So the highest point in these 4 worlds is called Chachma Ilah, and that's where the Jewish souls come from. Now, although the root of Jewish souls come from this high point, however, the souls went through the 4 worlds, and throughout these 4 worlds, the neshamas took on different forms and different images and different characteristics, resembling what they've gone through in that world, which again is similar to pregnancy in the physical sense, that a child who's born doesn't only have the DNA of his father, but also gets some of the DNA of his mother, right? So it picks up things along the way. So too, in every single world of these spiritual worlds, there are many different levels of souls, similar to the different levels and body parts that result from the original drop from the Father. So the difference of the various different souls in their ranks depends on how far they went through the process of devolution through the four worlds, and the further they go and the lower they go from their source, the more the holy elements of the soul is covered over, and they are on a lower rank. And so from the lowest level, from the end of the world of this spiritual world of Asiya, that's where the lowest souls come from, and they are what we call the souls of the simpletons and those who are lowly in rank, which often results in those people having a very minimal sensitivity to godliness. You might say, what do you mean? How is it possible that a Jew could not feel godliness? If a Jew has a unique soul that's a piece of God, what's going on here? Well, why do you call yourself an atheist, so to speak? So that's because, a toenail doesn't necessarily understand what's going on in the brain. And similarly, this soul, which went through so much trauma, if you will, in the four spiritual worlds, it comes down to this point, and it has a very minimal sensitivity to godliness. Again, at its core, that's what it looks like on the outside, but at its core, right, at its spiritual DNA, of course, it's still, at its very essence, a piece of God. So that part doesn't change. And that's why that's why we say, no matter where you may go, no matter where you may roam, you may always come back home, because the Jewish soul is always intrinsically connected with God. And that's what the Alter Rebbe says next. V'im calls that, and still in all, with all this, all of these souls, the souls of all the Jews, are connected and united with a yichud nifla va'atzum, with a wondrous and intense unity, with its original essence, with its original substance, which is really just a derivative of the supernal wisdom. So, in the analogy we gave earlier, that the multiple descents that happen to this drop from the Father until it gets to the point of toenails, it doesn't change the essence of that drop. And even in this form, in the toenails, it still is, at its very core, it is a drop of the Father. And therefore, the toenails are connected with their original source, which is the drop of the Father. So too in the analog that we're saying, despite all the descents that happened from the original Chachma Ilah, from the supernal wisdom, which created or resulted in many neshamas, until the neshamas of the lowliest of the lowest Jews. Nevertheless, there is no change in the essence of the soul. And even the lowest soul that has no feeling in godliness, because it literally ended up on the bottom of the heel, that soul too is a chelek alekami mal mamash, is a part of God literally above, because it comes from that chachma ilah. And that's why even the lowest souls, as we'll explain later in chapter 18, even if they're sinning outwardly all the time, they're willing to give their souls up for the holiness of Hashem most of the time. The exceptions to that are explained over there, why. But generally speaking, even the lowest, unobservant Jew is willing to give up their life for God. Now, why is this connection so strong? The Alter Rebbe continues, Ki nikas v'chayus nefesh ruach neshama shel amei haaretz, the nurturing of and the life of the souls of the simpletons. Humi nefesh ruach neshama shel tzadikim hachachamim. They get their souls, or they're nurtured from the tzaddikim, the righteous men, v'achachamim, and the wise men, again referencing the analogy of the brain. Rashi b'nei Yisrael shebederam. Who are those brains of the generation? The leaders of the Jewish people in that generation. So as we said earlier, the toenails of the sun gets its vitality from the brain of the sun. So too over here, we're saying that the low souls of the Jewish people get their spiritual vitality from the souls of the higher people in that generation, which are like the head and the brain of that generation. Because we explained before that in every generation, we have certain souls, certain heads of the Jewish people, heads of the thousands of the Jewish people, as he says, that their souls are the head compared to the lower ones. And we said that all neshamas, all souls in every generation, all Jewish souls are like one body. Mm-hmm. And the heads of that generation, the righteous men and the wise ones of the generation, they are the brain and the head of that generation. What that means is that not only are these souls that are like the brain and the head considered higher in rank than the other souls, but even more so, we're saying that all the souls of that generation, even the very lowest souls, get their vitality from the souls of those head souls, those brain souls. Just like all the parts of the body get their vitality from the brain. What does this mean? So, what is vitality for a soul? Is it protein? Is it cholesterol? What does the soul live off of? Obviously, the soul lives off spiritual food, which is a revelation of godliness. And life for the soul means feeling godliness and feeling attached to godliness. And this revelation of godliness is what gives a person vitality and ability to serve Hashem with Torah, with davening, with doing mitzvahs. Because all of these things are here to connect a person with God in order to thereby feel the light of Hashem. Now, since the tzaddikim, the rabbis of the generation, have their soul shining brightly, right? They're plugged in, so to speak. They're very much attached with the source of light, the source of vitality. So by plugging into the tzaddik, by attaching ourselves to the tzaddik, we get spiritual vitality. Even the lowest souls get spiritual vitality, and they get this godly infusion that they should also have a godly feeling in the Torah and the prayer that they do, and in all details of their life. So just to summarize, no, we went a little overtime. Sorry about that. But just as in the analogy, the affiliation or association with the nails to the brain is that they came about from the drop of the brain of the Father. And also after they became nails, they're still one entity with their source. And even after the Son becomes independent, all of his body parts get their vitality from the brain. And even more so, through them getting vitality from the brain of the Son, they're really also connected with the brain of the Father. And the same is also with the analog, that the root of all neshamas, the root of all souls comes from, the root of all Jewish souls come from supernal wisdom, from the top of Atzilus, from the peak godliness, right? And also after they come down and they descend through the various worlds, wherever your soul might come from, even the lowest souls from the bottom of the spiritual world of Atzilus, are still connected to their root in the supernal wisdom. And not just that, but the souls that are so quote unquote independent souls still get their vitality from the leaders of those of each generation. And by us getting our spiritual vitality from the leaders of each generation, we are attaching ourselves ultimately with Hashem himself. And that enables our souls to also be illuminated from the light of Hashem, from Chachma Ilah, which, as we said earlier in the chapter, Hashem and his wisdom are one. So, the bottom line is that just as our toenails are connected to our brains, and therefore our brains are connected to our source, to our fathers, so too, which is very appropriate since today we're celebrating President's Day, about our founding fathers, although that's not biological, that's a different nature. But in a spiritual sense, by us attaching ourselves to the Rebbe, and it's very interesting that the Alter Rebbe makes this point so early on in Tanya, that by attaching ourselves to a tzaddik, to a righteous person, someone who is plugged in, so to speak, more than ourselves, someone who's more spiritually sensitive and attuned to godliness, and again, not just more spiritually sensitive, that's like the toenails connecting to the knee, or to the stomach. The point is the toenails come from the brain. So we have to plug into the brain, to the Rebbe of the generation, and that's how we get our spiritual vitality. And you see this in reality, that those who are plugged in and they're connected to the Rebbe and they write to the Rebbe and they follow the Rebbe's instructions and they study the Rebbe's teachings, they're more plugged into God. That's how you plug yourself into God. So that's the bottom line from all this. And I'll see you all next week, and hopefully next week will be on time.